The wind howled through the skeletal trees, rattling brittle branches as Daniel Carter pushed himself forward along the narrow dirt path. His breath came in steady bursts, misting in the frigid morning air. The rhythmic pounding of his sneakers against the earth was the only sound, until he heard something else. A faint rustling. A presence just behind him. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. At first, he saw nothing but shadows stretching through the thinning woods. But then, a small shape emerged from the underbrush, weaving between patches of frostbitten grass. A puppy, golden-furred, small and trembling, was following him. He slowed his pace, expecting it to scamper away. Instead, the puppy stopped when he stopped. When he took another step, so did the dog. Daniel sighed, coming to a full halt. "Where did you come from, little guy?" The puppy cocked its head but made no sound. It was eerily quiet, no whimper, no bark, not even the faintest huff of breath. That struck him as strange, but stranger still was the dog's stare. Its eyes, an unnatural, icy blue, held an intensity that made his skin prickle. It wasn't just looking at him. It was studying him. Daniel crouched. The puppy shrank back slightly, hesitating, before stepping forward. Its fur was tangled and matted with dirt, but not enough to suggest it had been on its own for long. It didn't wear a collar. No tag. No sign of ownership. "Are you lost?" His voice softened instinctively. He reached out, expecting hesitation, but the puppy pressed its cold nose against his palm without flinching. Something about its touch sent a strange, electric tingle up his arm, like the shock of static against bare skin. Daniel pulled his hand back. The puppy didn't react. His gut told him to walk away. He wasn't in the habit of picking up strays, but the thought of leaving the tiny creature alone in the cold gnawed at him. He sighed, shaking his head at his own foolishness. "All right, but just until I find your owner." The puppy fell into step beside him as if it understood. By the time they reached his house, Daniel had almost convinced himself there was nothing unusual about the dog. Almost. As he pushed open the door to his modest home, the puppy hesitated at the threshold. It stared into the dim interior for a long moment before stepping inside. Daniel bent to untie his shoes, half expecting the dog to dart off and explore, but it simply stood there, watching. "You're a quiet one, huh?" He grabbed an old towel and crouched down, rubbing the pup's damp fur. Its body was ice-cold despite the warmth inside. He filled a small bowl with water and set it down. The puppy sniffed at it but didn't drink. He frowned. Not thirsty. A second bowl, this time with dry dog food, yielded the same reaction. The puppy merely sat, still watching. Unnerved, Daniel moved to the kitchen, searching his fridge for something fresher. He pulled out a leftover piece of steak, cut it into small chunks, and placed it on a plate. The puppy ate. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Okay, so you're picky." It wasn't until later, when the house had settled into its usual nighttime silence, that the unease crept back in. He had placed a blanket in the corner for the pup, but it hadn't curled up to sleep. It remained in the same spot near the doorway, unmoving, those eerie blue eyes locked onto him. The digital clock on his nightstand flickered, then reset. A soft hum buzzed in the air, so faint he barely registered it. His phone, plugged in beside him, glitched. The screen flashed before settling on unreadable symbols, a mess of distorted characters. Daniel sat up. His pulse ticked higher. His gaze flicked to the doorway. The puppy hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched. His breath came shallow as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The moment his feet hit the floor, the hum cut off. The air felt different. Thick, charged. The way it felt before a storm broke loose. Daniel rubbed his temples. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was just tired. The puppy finally moved. It padded forward with slow, deliberate steps, stopping a foot from him. The glow of the nightstand lamp reflected in its blue eyes, making them seem even more unnatural. Daniel swallowed. "You're a strange little thing, aren't you?" Again, silence. Then, without a sound, the puppy lay down at his feet. Something about that simple action made the knot in his stomach loosen. He wasn't sure why, but for the first time since bringing the dog home, he didn't feel watched. Didn't feel alone. He exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. He was overthinking. It was just a puppy. Just a lost, hungry animal. And yet, as he lay back down, staring at the dark ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was the start of something he wasn't ready for. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sensation of something watching him. His body tensed before his mind caught up, flashing back to the night before, the flickering electronics, the unnatural quiet, the puppy's unblinking stare. He turned his head. The puppy was still there. It sat at the foot of the bed, perfectly still, its eerie blue eyes locked onto him. The instant he shifted, the dog cocked its head, not in the typical, playful way a puppy might, but with a precision that made his skin prickle. Daniel exhaled, shaking off the unease. "Guess you're an early riser." He climbed out of bed, stretching, and the puppy stood in unison, mirroring his movement with an almost mechanical grace. The way it tracked him was unsettling, calculated, controlled. Maybe it had been trained. That would explain the odd behavior. "You need a checkup, little guy," he murmured, grabbing his keys. A vet visit was the logical next step. Someone had to be looking for this dog. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of wet fur. Daniel sat in the waiting room, the puppy nestled against his feet, while reception processed their check-in. He'd expected some resistance, whining, nervous pacing, but the dog remained unnervingly calm. Not just calm, silent. Other dogs in the room whined and barked, shifting anxiously in their owner's lap. A golden retriever across from him tugged at its leash, panting heavily, but the puppy at Daniel's feet didn't react. Didn't acknowledge the other animals at all. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up as a vet tech motioned him toward the exam room. He scooped the pup into his arms. It didn't squirm, didn't resist, and followed. Dr. Avery was a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She greeted him with a professional nod before focusing on the puppy. "Where did you find him?" she asked, already running her hands gently over its body, checking for any injuries. "He followed me home during a jog. No collar. Nothing. And he won't eat regular dog food, only raw meat." Dr. Avery's hands hesitated for a fraction of a second before she resumed her exam. "That's unusual." She checked the puppy's heartbeat, then his reflexes. Daniel expected her to comment on the unnatural blue of its eyes, but she remained focused. Then she found the scar. A small, circular mark, barely noticeable beneath the thick fur on its chest. Dr. Avery frowned, pressing her fingers over the area. The puppy remained still. "That's odd," she murmured. Daniel leaned forward. "What?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked to a cabinet, and retrieved a small handheld scanner, the kind used for checking microchip. She waved it over the puppy's back. No response. She tried again over its shoulder blades. Nothing. Finally, she moved it over the scar. A single, high-pitched beep echoed in the quiet room. Dr. Avery went rigid. The color drained from her face. Daniel sat up straighter. "What's wrong?" Dr. Avery slowly lowered the scanner. When she looked at him, her expression had shifted, from mild curiosity to something closer to fear. "Where did you say you found him?" Daniel frowned. "In the woods." "Why?" Dr. Avery took a slow breath, her grip tightening on the scanner. "I need to check something." She turned to the computer, typing quickly, her movements abrupt. Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched as she scrolled through something on the screen. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered over the mouse. The reflection in the monitor showed her face, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel's pulse ticked up. "Dr. Avery. This dog shouldn't exist," she whispered. Silence filled the room. The walls seemed to close in, the sterile scent of the clinic suddenly too sharp. Daniel stared at her. "What do you mean?" Dr. Avery swallowed, then turned the screen toward him. The document displayed a government seal. The heading read, Project Helix, Terminated Subjects Report. And there, next to a grainy, low-resolution image of a golden-furred puppy with unnerving blue eyes, was a status, deceased. Daniel's blood turned to ice. "That's not possible," he said. "He's sitting right here." Dr. Avery rubbed her forehead. "I don't know what's happening, but this puppy, this exact one, was part of a classified experiment. And according to this report, it was euthanized over a year ago." The room felt too small, too suffocating. Daniel looked down at the puppy. It gazed back up at him, unblinking. "How the hell is that possible?" Dr. Avery didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly and walked to the door. Then she locked it. Daniel's heart pounded. "What are you doing?" "You need to leave," she said, voice low. "Right now." A chill crawled up his spine. "Why?" Dr. Avery exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "If this dog is really from Project Helix, then someone is looking for it. And if they know you have it." A car door slammed outside. Dr. Avery went still. Through the frosted window, Daniel saw two figures step out of a black SUV. Suit. Sunglasses. The kind of presence that sent alarm bells screaming in his head. They were coming for the dog. Dr. Avery grabbed his arm. "There's a back exit. Go. Now." Daniel hesitated, adrenaline surging through his veins. But then he saw the way the puppy tensed, not with fear, but with something else. Awareness. It knew. The door handle rattled. A firm knock followed. "Veterinarian Avery," a voice called. "Open the door." Dr. Avery turned to Daniel, eyes urgent. "Run." Daniel didn't need to be told again. He scooped up the puppy, its warm body pressing against his chest, and bolted through the emergency exit. Behind him, voices shouted. Glass shattered. A gunshot cracked the air. Daniel sprinted down the alley, heart hammering, the puppy clutched tightly against him. He didn't know where he was going. Didn't know what the hell he'd stumbled into. All he knew was that nothing about this was normal. And whatever this dog was, whoever wanted it back, was willing to kill for it. Daniel's lungs burned as he sprinted through the alley, his grip tightening around the puppy. Behind him, the sharp crack of another gunshot echoed off the brick walls, followed by a heavy silence. No more shouting. No footsteps pounding after him. They weren't chasing. That realization only made his pulse pound harder. Whoever those men were, they didn't need to run him down. They were confident, too confident, because they knew exactly where he was going. Daniel ducked behind a dumpster, pressing his back against the cold metal. The puppy stirred slightly in his arms but made no sound. "Okay," he whispered, swallowing against the adrenaline surging in his veins. Think. They were after the dog. Not him. He could drop it, walk away, pretend he'd never seen it. But the thought turned his stomach. The puppy hadn't struggled when the shots rang out. It hadn't trembled, hadn't yelped in fear. It had simply curled into his chest, trusting him. And trust wasn't something Daniel could ignore. A distant car engine roared to life. He peered around the dumpster just in time to see the black SUV roll past the alley's mouth, moving slowly, scanning. They weren't gone. They were circling. Daniel exhaled sharply, pressing his forehead against the cool metal. He needed help. His fingers itched toward his phone before he froze. The glitching screen last night. The sudden electronic hum. He looked down at the puppy. It blinked up at him with those unnatural blue eyes. "That was you, wasn't it?" he muttered. The puppy didn't respond, of course it didn't, but Daniel didn't need an answer. He already knew. Taking a risk, he pulled out his phone. The moment he pressed the power button, static filled the screen, symbols twisting and flickering before the device shut itself off entirely. His gut twisted. This wasn't just some government project. Whatever they had done to this dog, it had given it some kind of effect on electronic, on energy, which meant if those men were tracking him, they weren't using standard GPS. They were following the signals. His phone. The clinic's computers. And they would follow again. Daniel cursed under his breath, shoved his phone deep into a storm drain, and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the only place that made sense, Layla's apartment. He hadn't seen her in months, not since their last argument, but she was the only person he knew who had dealt with this kind of thing before. Not dogs, exactly, but the secrets buried in classified government projects. Layla had been a journalist once, the kind who chased the stories no one else would touch. And it had cost her everything, her career, her reputation, her belief in any kind of justice. She was the only person he trusted. Daniel knocked, glancing over his shoulder. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. Then the door cracked open, and Layla's sharp brown eyes narrowed at him. "This better be good," she said flatly. Daniel exhaled. "It's insane." Layla's gaze flicked to the golden bundle in his arms. "Jesus, Danny. You came all this way for a puppy." He shoved past her into the apartment. "Not just a puppy." Layla sighed, shutting the door behind him. "You look like hell." "Because I'm being hunted." That got her attention. She folded her arms, giving him a slow once-over. "Start talking." Daniel set the puppy down. It didn't sniff around or explore. It simply sat, watching them. Picked him up on a run. He followed me home. No collar, no tag. Took him to the vet today and she found this. Daniel pointed to the scar on the pup's chest. "It's from a microchip, but not a normal one." When she scanned it, some government file popped up. Project Helix. The dog was supposed to be dead. Layla's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened against her arms. And then men in black SUVs showed up and shot up the clinic. She let out a slow breath. "Right." She turned, grabbed her laptop, and started typing. "Helix, Helix." She frowned. "There's nothing here." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Because it was buried. You know how this works." Layla tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking. What did the vet say? Not much. She was too busy telling me to run for my life. Layla huffed. Smart woman. Daniel hesitated. She looked terrified, Layla. Like truly terrified. Layla's fingers stilled. That's because she knew something you don't. Daniel swallowed. Yeah. And now I need to know it too. She stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing her temples. You are the worst decision I keep making. She turned the laptop screen toward him. No official records on Helix, but I found something. Whispers. Old research grants tied to unnamed bioengineering firms. Then there's this. She clicked an image file. A low-quality, grainy security photo. A dog cage. Inside, curled in the corner, was a golden-furred puppy. Daniel felt his stomach drop. That's him. Layla nodded grimly. And according to this, he wasn't just an experiment. He was the experiment. Daniel's mouth was dry. Meaning? Layla leaned back. I don't know exactly what they did to him, but whatever it was valuable enough for them to kill for. Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel heard it. A low, electronic hum. He turned sharply toward the window. The streetlights outside flickered, then died. Layla cursed, slamming her laptop shut. They found us. Daniel barely had time to grab the puppy before a loud knock rattled the door. Ms. Reynolds, a calm voice called. Open up. Layla went pale. Daniel backed toward the fire escape. We need to go. The door handle twisted. Layla grabbed a baseball bat. You run. I'll stall them. Daniel hesitated, but she shoved him toward the window. Go. He didn't argue. Clutching the silent, unmoving puppy, he scrambled down the fire escape as the door burst open above. He hit the ground running. Behind him, the men in black swarmed the apartment. Layla's voice rang out, sharp and defiant. Then, silence. Daniel didn't look back. He ran into the night, the golden-furred secret in his arms, knowing only one thing for sure. He wasn't ready for what came next. The city blurred around Daniel as he ran, the night air sharp in his lungs. The puppy remained motionless in his grip, tucked close to his chest, as if it knew silence was its best defense. The streets were emptier than they should have been, as if the entire world had conspired to clear a path, for him or for the ones hunting him. His mind raced. Layla was gone. Whether she was dead or taken, he didn't know. But her last words burned in his head. Run. He turned a corner into an underpass, the glow of streetlights flickering erratically overhead. The moment his feet hit the pavement beneath them, the lights went dark. A mechanical hum pulsed in the air, vibrating through his bones. They were close. His gut told him he had minutes, if that, before they boxed him in. Daniel scanned his surroundings, forcing his mind to slow down. Think. No phone. No way to contact anyone. No safe place to go. Unless. The puppy stirred. Daniel looked down, and for the first time since the chaos had begun, the puppy met his gaze, really met it. And for the first time, Daniel understood something undeniable. It wasn't just an animal. It was aware. "You're not a normal dog," he whispered. The puppy didn't blink. "Then show me what you can do." A rush of wind swept through the underpass, carrying the scent of rain, though the sky was clear. A static charge crackled in the air, lifting the hair on Daniel's arms. Then the street lights exploded. Glass rained down around him, and in that fraction of a second, Daniel bolted. Behind him, tires screeched against asphalt. A black SUV swerved into the alley, its high beams flaring. Daniel sprinted toward an old warehouse, metal doors rusted but slightly ajar. He slipped inside just as another vehicle roared onto the street. The moment he stepped into the darkness, the puppy twitched. Its body tensed, eyes sharpening. Something was already here. Daniel pressed against the wall, heart hammering. Heavy boots crunched against the gravel outside, deliberate and methodical. "Daniel Carter," a voice called, smooth and unhurried. Not a threat. Not a command. A statement. They knew exactly where he was. Daniel clenched his jaw. His only option was to run deeper, further into the warehouse's skeletal remains. But then, a whisper of movement. Not from outside. From within. He turned sharply, his breath catching. A figure stood in the darkness, half hidden by shadows. Not a soldier. Not one of the men in black. A woman. Tall, dressed in tactical gear, her stance rigid, but her expression cautious. And she wasn't looking at Daniel. She was looking at the puppy. Daniel took a slow step back. "Who the hell are you?" The woman exhaled, lowering her hands slightly. "I'm not your enemy." "That's exactly what an enemy would say," she huffed. "Fair." Outside, the boots grew closer. The woman flicked a glance toward the sound, then back at Daniel. "If you want to live, you need to trust me." Daniel swallowed. "Why should I?" She held his gaze. "Because I'm the one who got him out." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Out of what?" "You already know the answer. Project Helix." Daniel's grip tightened on the puppy, mind reeling. "They said he was dead. They lied." A car door slammed outside. A dozen footsteps fanned out, surrounding the warehouse. The woman tensed. "We don't have time for this." She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small device no bigger than a flash drive. She held it up, meeting Daniel's eyes. "This shuts off whatever signal they're using to track him," she said. "But I need 10 seconds. Daniel hesitated. Then the puppy licked his hand. A choice. A breath. "Do it," he said. The woman nodded. She pressed the device against the puppy's scar, and for a single heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a pulse. Not a sound, not a vibration, but something deeper. Like reality itself shifted around them. Outside, the shouts turned to confusion. Then panic. "They're gone," someone barked. "Where's the signal?" The woman exhaled sharply. "We've got a minute, maybe less." Daniel stared at the puppy. It blinked up at him, looking normal, looking like any other dog. But it wasn't. And whatever had been tracking it was gone. For now. The woman motioned toward a side door. There's an extraction point 5 blocks from here. We move now. Daniel hesitated. What happens to him? He asked. The woman's expression softened, just barely. We get him somewhere safe. Daniel glanced at the puppy, at the way it nestled against him, trusting. Then he nodded. They ran. Behind them, the voices grew frantic, orders shouted into dead calms, confusion thick in the air. But Daniel didn't look back. Because for the first time, he wasn't running away. He was running toward something. And he wasn't alone.